So hi folks, good evening and welcome to the Highlands and Islands Hustings event brought to you by the Pebble Trust. I'm Neil Sutherland, the Highland business owner and Pebble Trust trustee. The Pebble Trust is a Highland-based charity and we exist to support and promote more sustainable, equal and low-carbon society. I'd encourage you all to have a look at our website, thepebbletrust.org, a link of which will be posted on the chat. And you'll find lots of information there on the kind of projects, the research and initiatives we've been supporting over the last 7 or so years since we established. The Trust is apolitical, but we recognise the need for political support to achieve the necessary and urgent move towards stronger, resilient, more locally empowered economies and communities across the Highlands and Islands. We believe that it is often in the margins of things, away from the centre of focus, where creative thinking and doing is often derived and demonstrated. So a word this evening on the format in housekeeping. Attendees are all on mute, but the chat function is open and questions from the floor are welcome. To help the chair, it would be very useful if you make it clear if the suggestion you're making is to a candidate, the question, or rather just part of the chat. We have 2 polls on voter intentions, one at the outset and the other at the close. And the results of both will be presented towards the end of the event by our chair, Lesley Riddoch. We'll be joined shortly by 7 candidates and in strict alphabetical order, welcome. Andy Wightman, Independent. Ariane, Burgess even, Scottish Green Party. Emma Roddick, SNP. Jamie Halcro Johnston, Scottish Conservatives. John Erskine, Scottish Labour. Kirk, Torrance, Alba Party. And Molly Nolan, Scottish Liberal Democrats. So the idea for this Hustings event grew from the recent Scottish Ecological Design Association Land Conversations, 6 events which took place virtually through March and through April this year. The 5th of these was titled Changing Economic Patterns, Reimagining Where We Live and Work. and it had a particular focus on the Highlands. The main speaker at that event was Magnus Davidson. Magnus is a research associate with the Environmental Research Unit, North Highland College, UHI, based in Thurso. And Magnus has agreed to get us underway this evening with a 5-minute condensed version of his seed of provocation. And this will lead straight into the main event chaired by Lesley. So over to you, Magnus.
Perfect. Many thanks, Neil. I've got the easiest job tonight because I get to advocate 3 positions without being accountable to the electorate, which is quite nice. So the image that accompanies the advert for the Hustings tonight is that of the Cromarty Firth, an area I know very well. I grew up on the shores. With its stacked oil rigs, it's a testament to the age of oil. But for the last number of years, we've seen the yellow jackets, wind turbine towers and tidal turbines join the oil infrastructure. Thanks to £100 million of both private and public investment, the Cromarty Firth has cemented itself as the staging and assembly port for Scottish offshore wind development. There are plans for a new £100 million steel rolling mill as part of the UK's largest offshore wind fabrication plant, concrete floating bases potentially being built at Invergordon, a green hydrogen hub for the Firth, potential green port status, all capitalising on multi-decade, multi-billion-pound Scotland pipeline. Somewhat of an antidote to current Scottish failures in the renewable energy sector. From renewable energy technologies, the Highlands and Islands produces over 300% of its own electricity demand. Highland over 400%, and my own county of Caithness over 4,000%. Yet we still pay the highest prices in the UK and have some of the highest rates of fuel poverty. In Highland and off-Highland waters, we're looking at over 5 gigawatts of generating capacity, built or being built, with a further 9 gigawatts potentially being built out over the next decade and early into the next. When we include the islands, this increases further. This power offers us something special. We have a moral obligation to send power south, the insatiable appetite of the population masses in the south. But we should be also building associated, sustainable, appropriate sized industry to use this energy. Data, hydrogen, advanced manufacturing, to name but a few. So my first provocation this evening is to re-industrialise the Highlands and Islands. Rewilding. The Highlands are not a wilderness. This is a managed landscape, in some cases good, in some cases bad. Rewilding is often being pushed by metropolitan classes with little understanding of its land or its associated culture. The main landowning proponent in the Highlands is an absentee billionaire landlord. Rewilding is often anti-crofter, anti-farmer, anti-people, and looks to exploit an unjust land system and perpetuate our Highland landscape of clearance. But it is not always, and it does not always have to be. We are living through a climate crisis and ecological crises. Rewilding is a process of rebuilding a natural ecosystem by restoring natural processes and the complete or near complete food web at all trophic levels. We need rewilding, but we need to do it better. People can, should, and will be right at the centre of rewilding in Highlands and Islands. We can reintroduce people, culture, even language back into these landscapes, while enhancing the ecological health and biodiversity of the landscape. So my second provocation this evening is to take back control of our land and reclaim, restore and rewild our landscape. There's one strath here in Caithness in an area we now know as the Flow Country. It gets no mention in any history book. Upwards of 800 people were cleared from there from 1829 onwards. This is Wildland Area 36, part owned by the landed gentry, part owned by conservation charity. This landscape of clearance suits them both. I want to repeople this landscape. In the same time it takes a train from between Queen Street and Haymarket, people reintroduced and living here could get to work at the cinema, a swimming pool, a half dozen bakers, a half dozen lawyer offices, a college, a university, and many more places to work. Repeopling is not about asking people to live an 18th century subsistent lifestyle. It's a 21st century proposal working in a modern world. We can look to reinterpret our cultural landscapes. Carbon crofts is one example, being of the landscape, not just in the landscape. New people, new homes, renewed landscapes, restored landscapes. My third provocation is to repeople our landscape of clearance, not for past generations, but for future generations. Reindustrialisation, rewilding and repeopling are not uncontested terms in our region. The vision I paint is mine and you're welcome to all of it, some of it or none of it. If you agree with me, please work with me to deliver it. If you agree with some of it, but not all of it, tell us how you can improve it. If you disagree with all of it, paint a better picture. So with that, I'll ask each candidate in simple bullet points, what are their top 3 priorities to ensure a sustainable future for the Highlands and Islands?
Righty, well, thanks very much to Magnus. I'll say that, the folk from Thurso, they can fair talk, but that's what we asked him to do. Magnus we're trying to kind of make a connection between what inspired all the guys who put this Hustings together, and that was these conversations. Of course, they're impossible to encapsulate the vibe that went on between 300 people. Some of you might have been present, probably most of you weren't. So that was an attempt to kind of just put a snapshot of where those conversations got to, in the hope that it kind of creates a bit of a backdrop for what is to follow. My name's Lesley Riddoch. I am sadly not sitting in the Highlands today, although I do, if you can just see, have my mother's Caithness glass collection sitting on the top shelf there. She was a dirty weaker, although I think mostly from Pulteney Town. And I've spent a lot of time in the Highlands campaigning and doing various things there. So delighted to be trying to do the impossible here today. And that is trying to manage a virtual hustings with 7 extremely mouthy people. And thank God for it, because why would you be wanting to elect people that are going to sit in their hands and kind of speak? So they can all speak. And not only are we trying to do that, we're trying to feed in some of the big important themes that have been sent in questions already. And of course, people are chucking in questions as we're going along. So great. What I'm thinking that we'll try to do is we've collected the questions that have come in into some sort of themes. So there's about 7 or 8 big themes, as you would imagine. They're about the region. I always hate calling the Highlands and Islands a region, but nonetheless, that. Regional policy, forestry, housing, the marine environment, the climate emergency, the rural economy, and tourism. That's where the bulk of the questions came in. So the idea is to move through each of them in kind of clumps and to put all the questions, there's 3 or 4 questions in each of those areas. And just in the hope then that we won't have each of the 7, each after the other, answering the same question, people can please, when it comes to it, just pick the one that floats your boat. So, and I'm hoping that that will mean that we'll get a variety of different aspects of the same theme being tackled by all of you. So that's what lies ahead. However, Magnus chucked the main question into the arena to start off with, and that is to ask each of you really, what are your top 3 priorities for the Highlands and Islands? And this is really going to have to just be bullet points, because I hope you appreciate, with 7 of you, if each of you even takes 2 minutes to answer, that's a quarter of an hour, right? So, and I should say that for whatever reason, we don't have Kirk Torrance here from the Alba party. And I do see that there's Brian from the Restore Scotland party. That behind the scenes is being worked out as to how you, or if you can get a shout. So having said all of that, I'm also conscious that it can be difficult for people who are last constantly to have a new thing to say. So I've got a little grid here where I'll hope to keep revolving who starts off so that it seems kind of halfway fair. So on this first one anyway, we're just going to go through this alphabetically. And I do think only the Highlands could have alphabetical order determined by people's Christian names, which is great. So let's just stick to that one as we go through this first question. And honest to God, if you're going to take more than 2 minutes, I've got my wee counter here. I'll just jump in on you. So could we have your 3 bullet point, sorry to do this to you, but 3 bullet point priorities for the Highlands and Islands in 2 minutes or less? And we're going to start with Andy Wightman.
Well, thanks very much, Lesley, and thanks for the invite. Yes, my first name is A and my last name is W, so I usually come last. My 3 bullet points, I mean, the first one really is a process question, and that is that we need proper local and regional decision-making. We need decentralisation, we need power in the hands of the people. Scotland's one of the most centralised countries in continental Europe, and that's a historic phenomenon that we've faced. So we need to make a lot of these decisions, far more both in the region and in the community. And the outcomes as a result of that would not just be better, but they would tend to empower people, genuinely empower people in terms of their engagement in politics. That's the first, is a process point. The second is housing. People obviously need jobs, they need housing. And we have a housing crisis. This Parliament has failed to properly address it. Housing is a human right. And that is the second priority, so that folk who want to live here, who want to stay here, etc., can do so easily, cheaply, and conveniently. And the third is to regain control of the natural resources and economy of the region. It means all the resources, and it means more mutuals, more co-ops, more community enterprises, plus, of course, private sector business. But too often in the past, the resources of this area have been managed and owned by people outside. They've been extracted in primary form, and we've had no value added. So that's the big economic challenge, is more control and more value added. That's my third point. Thank you, Lesley.
Great, and that was a minute. So follow that, Ariane.
Thanks. So what I would do is start by activating the Scottish Greens Green Investment Plan, which would provide jobs across the region, revitalising housing, public transport, renewable energy, and restoring nature, and getting our broadband fixed. I would fund the private sector services properly so that we keep our schools thriving. The primary schools are the heart of so many communities. And also we would be able to provide healthcare closer to home and also care in the community. And I would tackle the democratic deficit through land reform and devolving power to communities with local councils for a much smaller sized population. And if I could have my way, I'd make it related to the bioregion. So we're really connected to the land that we're working in and making decisions about.
Good, thank you very much. Right, Emma, 3 points.
Thank you. Hi. First of all, I would increase access to a diverse range of sustainable, affordable housing, including retrofitting older homes and protecting and taking back social housing stock so that we can drive down prices and tackle fuel poverty and climate change. Secondly, community empowerment, including genuinely local democracy, which is missing in the Highlands at the moment, and devolving powers to local authorities, having people have more of a say in how their land is used and avenues to participate in planning processes. Finally, opportunities for jobs, skills, education and enterprise without the need to move out of the region to get it.
Great, this is extraordinary how succinct you all are. It's as if you'd even known that this was going to happen. Thanks very much. Jamie, 3 points.
Thanks, Lesley, and thanks to the Pebble Trust for the invite today. And they're very general because I thought we were going to have a bit more time to expand, but essentially the focus has got to be recovery from the pandemic. The second one has got to be making sure that that recovery is sustainable and meets the needs of people that live here already. And the third one would be making sure that new adaptations, new changes, and what we do in the future is about making the Highlands and Islands a great place to live, a great place to work, to come to move to, so that we've got sustainable population for the future.
Great. And John Erskine.
Thanks, and thanks again for organising this evening's hustings. You know, Scottish Labour are going into this election saying our only focus should be on a national recovery plan. And in the Highlands and Islands, I think there's 3 key points there. A community recovery, making sure that every community in Scotland is a place where people can grow up, settle and work with access to decent public services and freedom from poverty and hunger. Secondly, a climate recovery, helping us achieve net zero emissions in Scotland and sparking a green jobs revolution. And thirdly, a jobs recovery to ensure that every person who can work and wants to work in the Highlands and Islands has that offer of a job. So those are the 3 key things I think we can start doing in the next Parliament to ensure the recovery that works for the Highlands and Islands.
Great. We don't have Kirk still, I think. I mean, what the heck is he doing if he's not on this hustings, I would say. So Molly Nolan, your 3 points, please.
Oh, good. I don't have 5. Thank you, Lesley. So the first one for me is land reform. So tackling land hegemony and making the land we have more productive for local people. Secondly, I think we need a Highlands and Islands industrial strategy. We need to tie together the different strands of work that's going on. We actually need a Scottish industrial strategy, but I'll keep it more narrow today. And then thirdly, I think we need a social development strategy. So that's primarily focused at young people to retain them in the region, to help them return to the region and to help them build sustainable careers here.
Okay, that's great. We do have another candidate who's popped up in the chat here, Brian. I'm trying to find him scrolling up. Brian, I can't find your surname, Nugent, from Restore Scotland. Now, this is a wee bit of a cheeky one, but since you are here, we're just going to include you in this question, and then that's your lot, right? So Brian, if you're here, can you unmute yourself? Or can you be unmuted? And even can you come on video, although these things might be not up to you to control?
Can you hear me?
Aye, you're a voice from the ether.
Okay, well, one of the issues, certainly here in Shetland, and I assume in other parts of the Highlands and Islands, is the standard of housing. It shouldn't be beyond the wit of the Parliament. Everybody you talk to agrees that it's a good way forward is to insulate houses to above the fuel poverty standard. It's certainly an issue here in Shetland. I expect it is across many other places as well. I agree with Andy about decentralisation, and I just wonder about democracy. If I've got to make 3 points and I'm getting kicked off after that, I'm not quite sure why every hustings organisation decides how someone doesn't get on and some do. I'm astonished that Alba are getting on and we aren't. And that'll be my parting shot then, it would seem.
Aye, well, just before you go off, how many candidates are Restore Scotland standing?
We're a new party. We've got 2 candidates in the Highlands and Islands, and we've got 2 in the Northeast Scotland.
Okay. Well, I didn't organise this, so I don't know why you're in, who's in and out. But I mean, the contrast with Alba in terms of the number of candidates standing would be, you know, there's quite a contrast there. But anyway, Brian, you've said your piece. Thank you very much for that. Right, we're going to move on to the first of the sort of themes. And the first one, generally speaking, is regional issues. I don't know if this is going to work, because your brains are going to have to really go some, candidates, to try to remember all these questions. So let's try it for this first one. And if it really is too hard for you to remember all the different questions being asked, we'll think of something different. But here are all the 4 or 5 questions that were put in on this theme about regional power. One from John Palmer. What are your views on local governance and greater autonomy for smaller communities? Essentially, they'll probably all be similar-ish. One from Ian MacLeod. The Highlands and Islands covers a vast area, and in my experience, list MSPs are not heard from again until the next election. How do you plan on ensuring that will not happen again? The third, what are your top priorities for a rural New Deal for the region? And the fourth, what will you do to repopulate the Highlands and bring diversity and vitality back to the area? Now, I've just lumbered you with the same impossible task there is at this end of trying to pull all these questions together. But basically, that's one point about local governance, greater autonomy for small communities. What the heck about list MSPs, a rural New Deal, and how to repopulate the Highlands? So can you pick 1 or 2 out of that and try to answer? And this time we'll go backwards, as it were, and Molly will go first. Molly, for the Scottish Lib Dems.
Thank you. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. I think, you know, in terms of a rural New Deal, it's a really interesting thing. Personally, on my end, it feels like a bit of a soundbite. And I think the actual, you know, logistics of such a thing would be really interesting to look at, because we have got a very, very diverse region. It's a very large region. But just in terms of how we'd repopulate, I think there needs to be a really holistic approach. In some places, there's great need for housing. In other places, there's plenty of housing, but there's no jobs. What I think we can agree on everywhere is that broadband is not up to scratch. And that's going to be a really, really huge part in helping people work remotely. But I think the public sector needs to lead by example, and we need to be drawing civil service jobs back out into the Highlands and Islands, into specific communities, not just Inverness. There's a lot we can be doing, but you know, there's a lot of questions there, and I know we've got a lot of candidates, so I'll throw it over to the next person.
Okay, well, Kirk has now appeared. Hello, Kirk.
Hello there. I'm terribly sorry I was late. I've been stuck in the Highlands and Islands launch for the Alba campaign, and I'm afraid we went a bit too far out, of course, to get back in time. So
right.
Once again,
okay, well, you're here now. So I don't know if you caught the questions that I was asking there in that sort of theme about regional power. Did you catch them, Kirk?
I'm afraid not, if you wouldn't mind repeating it.
Okay, so there's so many questions come in and so many candidates, we're trying to theme them and clump them. So here are sort of some clumped questions on the general theme of the region. And I'm just asking you to pick a couple of questions out of this which really float your boat and you want to answer, so that we hopefully get a bit of diversity from the 7 and you're not all answering the same question one after the other over and over and over again. Yeah. So the first clump on regional stuff, what are your views on local governance and greater autonomy for small communities? The Highlands and Islands is a vast area, says Ian, and in my experience, list MSPs are never heard of again till the next election. How will that not happen if you're elected? What's the 3 top priorities for a rural New Deal? And how will you repopulate the Highlands? So do you want to pick a couple of things out of that and speak about them?
Yes, thank you. So I think that's a good one. I'll start with the second one, this idea of absence of list MSPs. I completely agree. We send people to Parliament and we never see them again and make all these promises. I think one of the benefits of being a list MSP is freed up a little bit more to do bigger things. Looking at deals to be made, particularly the idea of repopulating the Highlands here. Far too often people in Edinburgh look at the Highlands and Islands as some place to go on holiday or a place to retire, what have you, but it needs to be a place that's reindustrialized, repopulated, and the way to do that is to have greater connectivity to start with, not just roads, but also digital connectivity and a little bit of imagination, rather than treating it with this kind of softy approach of just thinking of it as a tourist attraction. We have to think about what all these latent opportunities that exist and how can we exploit them. Far too often people leave the Highlands and Islands and go to the cities and never to return again, and that's a very sad situation. So I'd very much like to be able to identify opportunities and make them happen, bring investments into the area, particularly around the big projects like the potential for the space industry, the renewable sector. There's lots of things that can be done that just don't seem to be getting done, and that needs to change. So, as a start.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, next is John Erskine.
Thanks, Lesley. A good set of questions there. I want to touch on local democracy. I think we've seen huge underfunding, and COSLA has said there's a black hole in council funding due to the cuts from the SNP. So that really has taken the legs away from local democracy and undermined communities in all parts of the Highlands and Islands. I've been campaigning in Lochaber and Skye over the past fortnight or so, and people constantly complain about the lack of decent services, the decline in their local democracy, and they feel that their communities are being left behind and aren't being listened to. So I think we need to reinvigorate local democracy by ending the cuts that we're passing down from Holyrood to local government in the Highlands. And that would really give our communities the say and the voice they want to be heard, because Inverness is a long way from Portree, and it's even further to Edinburgh. And I think people just don't think they're getting their voices heard at the moment. So I really want to invest in local government and make sure that our voices are heard in the community. I think there's ways to do that. We could look at strengthening the local area committees, and I think we need to look at more imaginative ways about how we invest in Highland Council. For example, in Skye, if we introduced a tourist tax, and the tourist tax that was raised on Skye was allowed to be spent exclusively in Skye instead of being taken into the coffers in Inverness, that could make a significant difference to the communities. We could repatch, the potholes. We could invest in our schools, invest in our communities. So I think we need to take a holistic view about how we can stop the cuts to our communities and actually use local government to increase democracy and community strength across the Highlands and Islands. I just want to touch on the list MSPs as well.
Can I just jump in, as I want to do? If you were doing that and you were keeping the proceeds of a tourist tax on Skye, for example, who on Skye would be empowered to make decisions about how it was spent?
So what we've got in Highland Council is a series of local area committees. So there's one for Skye and Lochalsh, there's one that covers Caithness and one that covers Welshire. So these local area committees would actually be strengthened, and instead of the decisions about budgets being taken in Inverness and the smaller community.
Okay, so who is on the Skye area committee?
Councillors fill in that local, those local wards that are included. I mean, I'm not the expert on it. Emma's a councillor in Highland Council, but I'm sure she would agree with me that, you know, the area committees are a good thing, and it's actually the way we can.
Right. I will shut up soon. Emma, what do you think of that idea, and how democratic is that, really? Because how many councillors are there? We've got the smallest councillor cohort in the Highlands and Islands for its size of
well, I think the issue isn't really that we don't have enough councillors, it's that the area is too big, and area committees go some way towards dealing with that. But personally, I think that the council itself needs to be broken up, and I would go into that in my answer actually as well. But John is absolutely right. All the area committees are made up of every councillor within that area.
Okay, right. So you were going to just finish that one off when I cruelly interrupted John with your how list MSP point.
Yeah, the list MSPs point. Yeah, I mean, I think we actually need to move towards a system that moves away from AMS and having this hybrid mix of first past the post and list, because it does create disparity. So, you know, I think in the next Parliament, we need to also look at the form of how we elect our MSPs, because it's not fit for
So what form do you want?
Well, I would like to move towards full PR and end the first past the post system.
Right, so the same sort of STV system there is for council elections?
Yes, I think that would be helpful,
Right.
particularly for areas like the Highlands.
Okay, good. Jamie, take your pick of all those questions about local governance, autonomy, communities, repopulation Highlands.
I suppose as somebody that, well, technically is still a Highlands and Islands regional MSP, I probably should say that it is a difficult area to cover if you were trying to cover the whole area. I think what most parties do, and I say probably all of the parties here will do that, is they tend to have people that represent certain areas or take on responsibility. Certainly, I've covered the Islands and Murray as a focus, and colleagues have covered the Highland area and others, Argyll and Bute. But you know, that's an unofficial process. But it's about how we deal with constituents, because otherwise you would be getting the same representation coming through again and again. But it does highlight, as I say, how difficult it can be, and it highlights, you know, the issues that happen to be of concern on Skye are very different, perhaps to Kingussie or Aviemore or Bewley or up in Caithness. So there is that concern. That's a very large area. I have to say there is some already, you know, certainly a lot of councils operate common good funds, which means money can be determined by local councillors for specific projects and the like. So that might be one way of increasing perhaps a kind of local involvement in some of these things, and a little bit more local accountability. I did want to talk about the rural housing very, very quickly there as well, because that's a real concern. We actually, through our rural commission, sorry.
Well, coming on to housing is so important. There's actually a whole section on that.
Oh,
so you
okay.
can stick that behind your ear.
Well, I'll simply then say that that was one of my priorities for any regional deal. Your
party leader talked about shipping, and so many party leaders talk about shipping power out of Holyrood. What structural ways are you going to do that?
Well, I think that's something what we've got to look at, but I think we've got to look at very carefully, because if you got probably everybody on this panel today would agree that actually taking power out of the central belt, for example, for the Highlands, and even within the central Highlands out to the peripheries, is important, is a good thing as a principle. But how do you do it? How do you make sure that? But
come crying in a bucket. That's why you're a candidate, and the rest of us are just sitting here. I mean, we're expecting you to come up with ideas. I'm going to be like this with everybody, by the way. So what are they? I'm so sick of hearing party leaders saying this. It's a cheap shot. You know, of course, everybody wants power out of Holyrood and power out of Snacky, but how are you going to do it?
Well, then what you're arguing is that central belt or largely central belt based leaders or parties that are operating from the central belt should be determining how policies are delivered for regional areas.
Jamie, you're sitting here. I'm seeing your kipper, man. You're here now. What is your idea?
You're right, but surely the best way of doing that is working with communities to find out where concerns are, what areas need improvement, what responsibility local communities want to take on, where they think there's a democratic deficit, working with them to come up with a structure which is right. That's not done by party leaders in election manifestos or even on panelists like this, just determining that, you know, it is about engaging with local communities and coming up with what people need, because everybody will have different ideas, everybody will have different input. Right. So that's the most important way, I think, of doing it, and that's absolutely the right way to do it. But there has to be the fundamental agreement that it needs to be done, and I think there is.
Okay. Well, just as a matter of interest, because I can see all the candidates here, Do any of you disagree with this? I mean, do all of you agree that you have to find a way to get power out of Holyrood and power out of Inverness? Can you just put your little mitts up if you, just broadly speaking, agree with that? Right, well then, is it not incumbent on you to try and find some way to enact this in your lifetimes? Because, as somebody who's getting older and watching this being said over and over and over again, it needs proposals. Right, I'm going to shut up and we're going to Emma next, right? I know you all want to come in, which is good. But anyway, Emma, go for it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll start with local democracy because I touched on it a bit already. I would also like more powers given to local authorities. The powers over managing numbers of second homes in the area, which the SNP is proposing to devolve next term, will be a great help in driving down housing prices in areas like Skye and Wester Ross by increasing the number of homes which are available for residents. Repopulation is probably going to be covered by every single issue that we'll discuss tonight, because it is about making the region generally a good place to live, an affordable place to live, and a place that has opportunities that you don't have to move away and then move back for. My party is proposing a £579 million investment in the expansion of superfast broadband so that every home in the Highlands and Islands will have access within the next 5 years. That, along with things like our Green Jobs Fund and a £20 million Rural Entrepreneur Fund, which will provide grants to support 2,000 new businesses. And we're really focused on promoting the idea that you can live rurally and also pursue productive, green, profitable careers.
Okay, right. Let's have Ariane next.
Okay, a few things. So I'll pick up on the local democracy. I have been pondering this for, what is the structure? How do we let that power flow down to, or so my work has been with community, and I think that communities are critical for the response to climate change, and also that where I think the governments tend to approach things still in this place of mitigation, where I actually think we need to be moving to adaptation, and communities need that power to make quick decisions and local, relevant to their bioregion, relevant to what they need.
Okay,
so how do we do that?
Yeah, quite. I'm just trying to feed in a question.
So I've been playing around with
Ariane, let me just feed a question in here, because that makes people realise we are actually listening to them too. Briege, who I imagine is Briege and Oban, is saying, as a community activist, I'm tired of hearing over and over again, we must ask communities what they want.
I read that question.
Right, so
me too. I'm tired as a community activist and organizer. So I've been working with a model called sociocracy or dynamic governance for quite some time. And I started to think, how could that, and I'm not going to go into it because it's like it's a system of governance and decision making that really empowers people. It makes sure all voices are heard. And I think we need something like that kind of system at a community level, and then networked out, so you've got much more smaller groups of people making decisions about place. So I was chatting with a friend who's stuck in France because of lockdown, and she's in a town with 250 people and a mayor. So we need more funding at that much more community level where we can be taking those decisions. This is not going to be an overnight change, but we need to get going. And so this kind of like these groupings of community, and I think place-based, bioregionally based is really important too, because if we want to really embed ourselves in nature and respond to what's happening locally, that's important. And networked out across, and then looking at where does it make sense to have to work together and have scales. So like obviously things like a bus service owned by a small group of people doesn't make sense, but let's have a bus service that's networked and owned by a region or an area or a bigger area. So I think there's a whole lot of design work that needs to happen, but I would like to see it happen with communities, and I would like to see local authorities there to facilitate communities, which is not really happening. It's happening in bits and pieces. And the other thing that I'm really picking up is that—
Stop. Right, so the thing there is though, that here's these communities, plucky little communities with no resources, no framework, no elections, right? And everybody's coming tanking in, expecting more and more
so
from
Lesley,
these
absolutely
people.
not. That is one of the problems.
Burnt out.
Absolutely no. So that's what we need, radical change at a community level, because absolutely I see too much volunteer work, too much burnout, too much of the same people doing this, showing up in the same, the kind of valiant people.
Okay, but I'm not hearing, Ariane, I'm not hearing your proposal for how you create a structure.
So the structure is sociocratic. So the structure is that people come together and they have the power to make decisions about their place, and they have the financial power as well. So we bring the money down to that level. We need to get away from this system where people are, charities that are constantly applying for funding, that then they have to write reports for a year.
Right.
Well, so it's a much bigger topic, and I've got the ideas.
I'm just conscious that people need to speak.
Yeah. So I want to say one more thing. You
asked
and
no, stop. Right. I'm just conscious of time with everybody, so I'm trying to be roughly sort of fair and brutal.
Roughly
Andy,
fair.
Yeah, roughly fair. Andy, right? Of all those options, local governance, repopulation, and so on.
Well, I want to start with the MSPs. I've been an MSP for 5 years. I haven't been absent. I don't know who is, but no doubt some are. And I've got one proposal in this election, which is, if elected, I would call for the establishment of a Highlands and Islands caucus or alliance. This is common in other countries, where parties, we do work together in Parliament, well on regional issues, but it tends to be ad hoc. So if maternity services are under threat in Caithness, or if a bus services or whatever, but we need more strategic working. And that includes committing to working in a caucus and an alliance with rules and a constitution, which means ultimately as well, on occasions, breaking your party whip to stand up for the interests of your constituents. So I'd like to explore that. On local democracy, I've been campaigning for better local democracy for 20 or 30 years.
Andy,
yes.
When you were in the Scottish Greens, could you have done that?
No.
Right. So what are you asking these guys? They're not going to be able to do this, are they?
Well, I'm going to challenge. I'm going to challenge. Right, we'll have that conversation down the line, okay? But if I'm not elected, that won't happen. Local democracy is absolutely vital. Now, you asked the model, right? We have spent since 1975, we abolished 200 town councils. Then we had districts and regions. We still had Skye and Lahalsh and Lochaber and Southern District Council, and then we got rid of them. So all we've got is regional councils. We have no local democracy. We have no local councils at all. And that was pointed out with the Macintosh Commission right at the beginning of devolution. That's one reason why I steered through a bill in Parliament to bring into Scots law the European Charter of Local Self-Government, which is now being challenged in the Supreme Court. But we need more of the normal continental European model, where you have much, much smaller councils who cooperate with each other. So, for example, in Norway, you've got tiny council of 5,000 or 6,000 people, smaller than that indeed, but they're responsible for fire and rescue. How do they deliver fire and rescue with 4,000 people? They cooperate. How do they deliver primary education? They cooperate. How do they deliver environmental services? They cooperate. And they cooperate with different formulations of local municipalities according to the service. So fire and rescue depends on transport and all the rest of it. So if we got back to the district councils, that would be a start. We have Orkney. I think Tim or somebody in the chat was saying we don't trust Orkney Council. It's a small council, but this is at the heart of it. We need to build more trust in elected officials to work for and on behalf of their constituents. And the fact that people don't trust councils is not an argument for not having more local democracy. But that's hard work that everyone needs to put in, because the bottom line is, if you centralize all these decisions, you'll get bad decisions. Emma talks about the SNP bringing in regulations on second homes. It's actually just short-term lets, not second homes. And when they put the legislation through Parliament, there's a ministerial veto. So ministers in Edinburgh have to consent to a short-term let area. That's why I voted against it, despite having campaigned for 4 years to regulate short-term lets. So we need to get away from this instinct of ministers constantly centralizing things and telling local authorities what to do, and we need to build genuine local democracy.
Andy, there's been a question for you specifically right at the beginning, which was, as an independent, how can you deliver what you're promising?
Well, every MSP is faced with the same question. You get some MSPs who are members of parties who are not in government, some MSPs are members of parties in government. You have a mix in Parliament of people with powers, but the bottom line is every single MSP should be speaking up on behalf of the constituents in the region or the constituency they're elected. And the power of argument, the power of oratory, the power to amend legislation, the power to campaign is very influential. And every single MSP should use it instead of sitting on their hands and just voting the way their party tells them.
Right. Okay. Before we move on to another section, there was lots of people that wanted to come in when I started taking a Maddie and challenging Jamie, I think, about how you're going to get structures together that get power out of Inverness and Edinburgh. Does anybody want to come back in on that now, just to kind of,
I'll jump in.
practicalist? And just by the by, does anyone want to do Andy's thing and have a Highland Caucus?
Can I jump in, Lesley?
Yep.
Yeah, so I mean, a good example of how we actually get power out of Edinburgh and Inverness, if you take the example of the Islands Bill, and that inbuilds decision making and a demand for recognition of the issues that face the islands throughout legislation. So I think we need to actually have like a Highlands Bill that would also take the power out and ensure that any decisions that are being made or any legislation that's going through takes account of the issues facing the communities that's going to be affected by that.
John,
yep.
Can I just ask you, what are we then going to have? A Villages Bill? A sort of Crofts Bill? A Northeast Bill? When are we going to get local democracy in Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not one solution fits all. I mean, I think we need a mix of things, such as investing in local government, having these local committees that have more power and more money. Just
can I ask you something? The area committees, I know they exist and I know how it works, but if they were working well enough, you all would not have raised the problem of people feeling there's unaccountability and people feeling powerless. So let's just say that the area committees don't seem to be enough. Molly had her hand up but wasn't sort of shouting, so I didn't notice her. Molly, come in.
Thank you. I mean, I just wanted to talk about, the past for a minute. I think we've had some good solutions in the past that have since been broken up for whatever reason or centralized for whatever reason. But, the HIE, the Highlands and Island Development Board of the past, was quite successful. And it was successful because it did have regional outposts. So I think looking at what we had already and seeing if we can make that fit for the 21st century is quite a sensible thing to be doing.
Okay, and Kirk, you wanted to come in? Did you?
Yes, thanks, Lesley. Yeah, I hear a lot of people talking about devolving power, and then I'm hearing people saying make more committees. I think maybe we've got too many committees. I think probably, I'm very much in favour of devolving power from London and from Edinburgh and getting it right into the heart of things. We don't need more government, we need much less of it, and we need to entrust people in local communities to know what they need and to be able to do it and to get action going. Having more committees and more red tapes and more decisions, people, as soon as it goes to committee, nothing gets done. So we need people with a little bit more autonomy and a little bit more
Kirk, you need to, at the moment, if you want to get stuff done on Sky, you need to get an area committee to approve it, and they're composed of councillors elected in a huge constituencies. I have to say, probably many of you know, a very good friend of mine is Jean Urquhart, who used to be a councillor. She had one of the biggest council areas. Her council ward is the size of, small countries. And I used to find her asleep outside her house after doing her ward rounds. So unless you change that structurally, it'll keep happening.
Well, absolutely. I heard it mentioned early on about radical change. I agree. I think we need to.
Right, Kirk, I'm waiting for the proposal, man. What is it?
Yeah, well, I agree. I mean, the Highlands and Islands region is twice the size of Belgium. It's too big. It needs to be divided up, and certainly we need to understand that and rearrange that whole thing. But
Kirk, listen, you sound like you're kind of blethering a bit there. What is your actual proposal?
Well, I think we need to empower people in local government and give them more power to actually get things done. They know what they need to do on the ground, and we need to give them that power. It's evolving it.
Okay,
as soon as we get out of this.
No, I'm not hearing a proposal yet, so just stop. Right, has anybody else got a proposal about what to do about this? Not just agreeing that it's a problem, but a proposal that you would push as an MSP. That's what we're asking for here. Anybody? Ariane?
So I just want to say I was joking when we were backstage about, we could turn this into a 2-day conference. Just this question is a 2-day conference. But I think that what I was trying to convey, I'm not going to try to go into the details of that because it takes 2 days to train people the basics of it. But I do think we also need to be thinking of how we learn, like schooling at the moment, still to me feels like we're schooling for a job. And I would like to see us change the education system so that we are learning to be whole people that are, part of communities, and that the skill sets that you learn in school are about showing up and being a part of a community. Because I think often the things that happen that become difficult at community level, and in the kind of tension that we are going to be facing with the climate emergency, we need skill sets. We need those skills to make decisions well together, to move through conflict together, that kind of thing. So I'd like that as part of my solution, and we can have a longer conversation another time about the rest of it.
Okay, I'm seeing that although this hasn't been asked in as one of the themes, which is a bit odd, there's lots of questions coming in about land. So there's one, I can't quite see who it's from, but basically picking up what Magnus said at the start. How will you give the land back to the people who live here and the people that would live here if they hadn't had to move out for housing and work? That seems a pretty sort of core one. Does anyone want to pick that up that hasn't just spoken? Right, Molly has just spoken. Anybody else? Yeah, okay, I think we've got Emma there. Yeah, Emma.
Hiya. Well, yeah, first of all, we've got a manifesto commitment in the SNP to move towards a presumption for community purchase when major land goes up on sale. So that will itself promote community ownership, which I think is absolutely required in terms of making land ownership more diverse in the Highlands. And we're also looking to move towards
stop you there. I'm going to be a bit nasty to everybody. So how much does land ever come up on the market?
Well, there's land on the market right now. So
enough
pretty
to
much
make the change
constantly.
that you want. Is that enough?
Well, it depends on the community, really, doesn't it? And when a land comes up for sale, any kind of land, it's what the community wants to do with it that makes it majored or not majored. So I think there's potential in any land that's on the market.
Is we can all agree, perhaps, although Jamie might beg to differ, I don't know. But at the moment, Scotland and the Highlands and Islands particularly has got the most concentrated form of land ownership in the developed world. This cost of land is sky high. So if you want to change that, how are you going to change it? And I'm only pointing out that the mechanism you've just come up with first, which is to try and get community rights to buy on stuff that comes onto the market, won't change the pattern very quickly at all, because not enough comes on the market.
I suppose, well, land reform is a constant thing, you know, it's constantly evolving, but this alongside things like the Scottish Land Fund, which is aimed at supporting communities to become more sustainable and helping them to own land, has been increased to 10 million a year since the SNP came into office. So I think these things alongside each other are, and certainly normalizing community buyouts is going to, whether you think it's too slow or not, mean that we are going to see greater diversity of land ownership in the Highlands and Islands.
Okay, Andy?
So do you want me to ask that specific question?
The specific question, how will you give the land back to the people who live here and the people who would live here if they hadn't had to move out?
Well, I mean, you know, Emma talks about land funds of 10 million, and that would buy you one estate. So, and you've got to start by regulating the land market. I mean, people from anywhere in the world can come and buy land here, and that means that prices are sky high. So the first thing we need to do is regulate the market. So the priority goes to people who need land and have business opportunities here. And that includes, for example, land for housing, which we'll probably touch on in a little bit. The second thing we need to do is reform our tax system. So it is utterly ridiculous, for example, that Sheikh bin Rashid Al Maktoum, who's one of the richest men in the world, who owns a big estate in Westeros, gets small business bonus scheme, like he doesn't pay non-domestic rates. What's all that about? It is utterly ridiculous. We need to reform our laws of inheritance, which no government in devolution has done. So children have still got no legal right to inherit land whatsoever. So it typically goes to one person, typically the eldest son. And community buying land is not the answer to land reform, because they can't afford it, and in many cases they don't want it. I remember at the beginning of the Isle of Egg thing in the early 90s, a chap on Egg said, look, I've had to fill in 4 pages of a form to buy a washing machine on hire purchase. This guy just bought the island. He doesn't have to do anything. That's ridiculous. And just because your island is failing or the landowner is failing doesn't mean that you should go and buy it any more than if the police are not delivering or the schools are not delivering for kids, you take it over. We've got to have structural reform in the land market. And that means starting where people need land, which is mainly about housing, but we'll come on to that in a minute.
Okay, John, does Labour not want to nationalise land?
Well, look, Lesley, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I know more about land reform than Andy Wightman here. He's literally written books on it. So I defer to his excellent knowledge on the subject there. What I would say is that the first Parliament and the first Scottish Parliament in its first 2 terms made huge progress on land reform. And that has really stalled over the past 10 years, and very little has been done by the previous SNP governments. So yeah, I mean, what Andy says is absolutely right, and I don't have all the solutions, but we need to turn our focus back to that in the next session, because we have totally stalled on land reform. One of the key issues in the first couple of terms. So I do want us to go back and seriously look at this issue and end the unfair ownership of land in Scotland, because it's just not
okay. Right, can I just play in 2 more questions that are sort of related, just so that those who haven't spoken can pick these up potentially? One is from Philip Blake. The Highlands are currently being deforested due to premature felling for wind farms and biomass and no replanting. What are the candidates' views on the decline of commercial forestry when so much suitable land is available in the Highlands, and Britain is the 2nd biggest importer of wood in the world? And there's another one from Matthew Thompson, another forestry one. The commercial forestry industry would like to know what you will be doing for the future of this industry. At the moment, we are losing more and more of our productive crop to non-productive species. The UK imports 80% of what it consumes, so we are missing a trick. We are in a severe crisis. So these are 2 questions about forestry as an industry, but obviously there's still the kind of biodiversity issues sitting within that too. Who hasn't spoken? Molly, are you wanting to answer this? Kirk, Jamie? Don't rush. Jamie, aye?
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't sure what the kind of process was for identifying. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I was actually doing the NFUS Hustings yesterday, and there was this topic came up around forestry, and it was almost from a different point of view, which was about the kind of pressure of forestry on land that, good farming land or good agricultural land that could be used for farmers and crofters. But to start off with, from my party's point of view, we want to see 18,000 hectares of new planting every year, but we also want to make sure, and part of the question was about making sure it was commercial, but also we also want to make sure that there is some of that native species, native woodland, that does provide an important role in biodiversity. But this is very much a balance. I mean, there are obviously areas where forestry is suitable and other areas where they're not. And it's making sure that what we do as a government, potentially the future, is working to identify where the capacity is and where is the right place for it to be done, both for the commercial side of the forestry sector, but also for biodiversity, the role that it plays in supporting biodiversity. So it's a good question, but it is very much one. And I think I'm from last night's hustings. I think pretty much all the parties were agreed on pretty much on that point. But as I say, it's about making sure that we know where it's going to go, and there's a right balance between the two.
Just while I've got you talking, have you got any views on land reform?
Yeah, well, I mean, you assume, I think, a little bit, Lesley, that my position will be one way. I mean, I don't think it's probably, or maybe it is surprising that I recognise that somebody owning, say, 20,000 or 200,000 acres in itself doesn't cause issues. I think one thing I would say is actually a huge amount of land ownership, or those who own land, depending whether it's large scale for large estates or even whether it's for agricultural use, play a massive role not only in managing that responsibly, but also investment in their communities. And I think, this may not be a popular position to take, but I think the idea that all land ownership is a bad thing when it's above a certain amount is probably false. I mean, one of the issues I think that was touched in certainly through the chat was about making sure that there's land available for people to live and to live locally and to buy locally. Rural housing, which is one of the things I kind of touched on early, is a key area. The Scottish Government promised a rural housing fund, which was going to provide for about 500 houses, I think, a year. It's delivered 80 so far. So it's a major issue.
It is. It's got a whole section that's coming next. Right. So
all right, we're still on it. Okay.
Leave it there. Right. Molly, land or forestry?
So I'll come in on land first and then possibly move on. But I think you know, some of the issues that have been talked about in terms of the solutions, we're talking about the need to, for want of a better phrase, remove the red tape around helping communities acquire land and actually build homes. So, I mean, one thing that I'm very keen on is the idea of a very localized service that would help connect communities, local authorities, landowners, and housing associations together, because at the present moment, it's very difficult, for example, the council to actually get in touch with landowners in a formal way. And something else that I think is a fairly important part of things is that, you know, we have the Scottish Land Commission, they do a lot of good work. They don't have the powers to legally enforce their Code of Rights and Responsibilities protocols, which governs the relationship between landowners and communities. And if we could make that legally binding, as it is with the Tenant Farming Commission, I think that would go a great deal as well, because obviously most landowners are absolutely fine, but in those instances where communities do come into conflict, they need to have some sort of process.
Right. Kirk, any thoughts on land issues or any of those forestry questions I mentioned? Kirk?
Yeah, so in terms of all this land, I'll come on to the forestry in a minute, but I think, you know, we need to start with this idea of a development land value tax. You know, we need to stop all this hoarding of tons of property in either companies or in individuals' hands. So, you know, that would start to de-incentivize that hoarding and incentivize people to sell it off if they're not using it. I think that's maybe a good starting point. At that point, you have companies going in and creating entrepreneurial opportunities to start some of this forestry stuff. And I think you need to start with the first things first. And I think that's probably it. In the Alba manifesto, we have proposals for the development land value tax. And I think it's very important to start with what's needed rather than talking about all the other stuff that has to come later.
Okay, there's a question that's just come in. Maybe Andy wants to have a look at this. Does an increase in commercial forestry conflict with rewilding with native woodlands, asks Ian.
No, not necessarily. I mean, you know, we should have about 30, 40, 50% of this region covered in woody vegetation. That will include scrub in the mountains, it'll include Atlantic rainforests, it will include commercial forestry, it will include native woodlands. This idea, I think someone in the chat talks about non-productive trees. Well, I mean, you've got roads like the A83 at the Rest and Be Thankful have cost us tens of millions of pounds because the hill above it is falling down. Any other continental Europe country, those would be protection forests. It would be a criminal offence to actually interfere with them to stop erosion. And it's you know, it's the native species that do that. And the other thing is the ownership. I mean, forestry is a fantastic industry. I started my political campaigning against the afforestation of the flow country in Caithness and Sutherland, not so much because of the environmental issues, although they were important and we're now reversing all that, but because of the ownership, because we're giving millions of pounds to people in London to plant these trees. We've still got 2/3 of our private forests are owned by absentee owners, and half of them don't even live in Scotland. So we need a big increase in forest cover, and we need it to be owned by local people and communities and businesses. And we also need vertical integration.
How would you do that? Because everything is big is beautiful. So how would you get lots of small ownership of forestry? You do that through land reform, because you've got to get the land in the smaller parcels, right? And we've already just discussed that. And we're 200 years behind Europe, because if you look at countries like Finland and Sweden and places like that, they have smaller units of land ownership, but they cooperate with each other. And that's why some of the world's biggest forest products companies, like in Finland, Metso Cooperative, are cooperatives of tens and hundreds of thousands of people who not only grow primary, but also vertically integrate and get the benefits from the paper and the wood products. And that's not what we're doing. We're allowing global multinationals to take our raw material, ship it way down to Liverpool and places and make products there. We need much more value added here. Right, housing. Here's the next clump of questions, and we're going to have different people coming first. Housing. Megan McInnes is asking, how would you tackle the affordable housing crisis in remote rural areas of the Highlands and Islands? Hector McLeod asks, how do the candidates propose balancing the issue of solving the real housing crisis young people are experiencing on Skye without affecting the thriving tourism industry? Carol Ingalls from Skye asks if elected, what will you do to address the housing crisis for young people? And Carol Hamilton asks, affordable housing is a real issue. What do you intend to do beyond the current sticking plaster approach? So affordable housing, young people, the conflict between housing for young people and anybody actually, and the tourism industry. These are all the questions that have been asked there. So let's go to John to start off with this time.
Yeah, and I'm not surprised many of those questions came from Skye, because nowhere more is this issue felt in the Highlands and Islands than on Skye, which is, you know, at the forefront of the pressures that are being put on local communities through tourism and through the SNP's failure to regulate short-term lets effectively. So, you know, fundamentally, to go back to the start of this issue, there are 16,000 people in the Highlands and Islands currently on waiting lists for housing in the Highlands and Islands. That's just abysmal. It's just not good enough. So, and it's not an issue that's appeared overnight. So again, the Scottish Government has taken their eye off the ball and allowed this huge issue to develop. So we really need to just get building more houses. And obviously there's issues around access to land, there's issues around how quickly we can build those houses. But we really need to make this a focus of the next Parliament. So I want us to build thousands of houses locally in the Highlands and Islands, available for local people to stay in and keep our young people in the region. And we really need to set the ambition to end the housing crisis in the Highlands by at least the end of the next Parliament, because it's just going to cause us huge issues and it's going to be damaging to our economy and it's going to lead to more people leaving the Highlands and Islands. You know, it's not just an issue of supply though as well, it's an issue of the quality of housing. The housing stock that exists in Highland at the moment is very poor. You know, a third of homes are still living in fuel poverty. So we also need to tackle that, because the homes that people are in often aren't good enough. And, you know, that's just another issue that we need to tackle. So the housing issue and the pressures put on housing, it can be resolved by creating new jobs and retrofitting houses and making sure that they're sustainable and warm. We can build more homes to allow our young people to stay. And we also need to regulate the industries like Airbnb to make sure that local people aren't being priced out of their communities and people aren't coming in to buy second homes. So I also want to see further regulation on the purchase of second homes to make sure that our communities aren't being hollowed out, because we've seen that in Edinburgh city centre be hollowed out, and we just cannot allow that to happen in our tourist hotspots in the Highlands.
Okay, right. There's a specific question from Lorna Walker, who's asking, should changing a house from a permanent residence into a short-term Airbnb be a change of use that requires planning permission?
Yes.
Yes or no?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Jamie?
All right, sorry. You wanted to comment on that and the other parts at the same time?
Well, just since that's come in, I'm trying to, you know, just keep spinning a number of plates here, and when it comes in, I'm just throwing it at you.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think it's an area that's a genuine of concern, and certainly up here in Orkney, there's a number of properties I know of that have changed from being from being either crofts or permanent homes into.
Jamie, everybody, let me just check this. How many people agree? Just put your hands up as candidates. Should changing a house from a permanent residence into Airbnb require planning permission as a change of use? Put your hands up if you agree. I can't, Kirk, you've gone awfully dark there. I can't see if you're even there. Have you got your hand up or not?
No, I don't. I'm just trying to.
Okay, that's fine. Right. Okay. So it'll be interesting to pick out why you think, what else you think could happen then. So Jamie, you don't think that is the way
sorry, Lesley,
forward?
I thought you were asking me for a little to expand on it. I wasn't aware that it was just a one-off. I mean, I think that you know, it's easy to put my hand up and say yes, I agree, or no, I disagree. But actually, there may be other issues around it. I certainly think there's a real issue with private properties becoming you know, holiday lets and the like, and I think or second homes. I think that's an issue. There may well be other areas around it. It's easy to stick a hand up and say this is what I agree, this is what I don't. But there's nearly always other parts to it.
Right. So I'm waiting. I mean, sorry, I'm just like a blooming broken record here, but I'm waiting to hear proposals then. That's a proposal, right? So what's your proposal if it's an issue and a problem?
Yeah, I was just going to counter. That's what I was asking, whether you wanted to thought what I was discussing. Okay, so there's no doubt there's a number of areas around and areas of concern around this. I mean, if you actually look at some of the, even where there is land available for sale, plot costs are huge, you know, in parts of the Highlands all the way across. So that even if people are looking to self-build, that can be a real issue. I mentioned obviously before about the Rural Housing Fund not delivering on what it said it was done. But, you know, I think the simple answer is we do need to build more homes. We do need to make sure that homes are built. Now, why aren't they being done at the moment? There are a number of areas around that. One, availability of land. Two, that when a land does become available or somebody is looking to build, it can take a huge amount of time to actually get all the different parts ready. The local council getting the planning consent through, the planning permission through, the utility is coming and doing checks, actually making sure that services are provided, and that then can delay some of these issues, delay some of these bills beyond the point that actually it's feasible, and that's been an issue a number of times. So I think it's about building more houses, but it's also making sure that the planning setup is in the right place so that can happen rather than acting as a barrier. Right,
Emma. And I'm seeing there's a flurry of questions coming in here about this question of second homes. It's clearly something that really animates people. Anna B is saying, what do you intend to do about the number of second and holiday homes? In too many communities, they outnumber permanently occupied homes every time there's a housing development. Many are bought as holiday homes, second homes, buy-to-lets. So can we just get a focus on that, specifically the second home thing first?
Absolutely, and I'm seeing in the chat that folk are saying it's not just a Skye issue. That's absolutely right. There are places in Wester Ross and Sutherland where up to 50% of residential properties are not being used as residences. Andy actually incorrectly corrected me on my party's policy earlier. We are proposing powers to councils to manage the number of second homes in an area. This, alongside the short-term lets regulations that he mentioned, will create opportunities to manage the number of homes which are lying empty most of the year while we have thousands of people on the housing list, including many who are homeless.
So
I'll touch as well.
Can you tell us what that would be then? How can a community put a limit on second homes?
So this has been discussed because we had proposals for short-term let regulations in the last term of the Parliament, and this has come to council already. And we're looking at saying, right, here's an area of high pressure of housing. This needs to be tackled. In terms of short-term lets, you would have to apply for a license after a certain period of time to be allowed to let it out. And second homes, it's much more of a baby policy because it's a new one. That's not one that was discussed in the last Parliament. But personally, I'm really excited to see that local authorities will be getting that kind of power because, as I say, in the Highland Council, Skye, Wester Ross, Sutherland, it is such a massive problem.
Okay, right, where are we? Ariane.
Yeah, so the Greens want to regulate second homes and require planning consent. And also we are actually open to the idea of setting aside pieces of specific areas of land. So speaking specifically to one of the conversations that's happening around the Western Isles and the fact that we're losing the Gaelic culture. So we're open to looking at the idea of supporting Gaelic speaking people and creating housing and protecting housing for people who want to live there.
I'm seeing a couple of people coming in. Thank you for that, Ariane. I'm moving on to Andy now, who are saying, why are holiday homeowners not subject to a 100% council tax surcharge, like owners of long-term empty properties? If you're in housing need, both are unavailable to you. Andy, just the question of second homes.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree that converting a property from a main residence to a short-term let or a main residence to a second home should be a change of use. Now, it's great the SNP are going to propose that because the SNP and Tories opposed my amendment in the planning bill to do precisely that. So we do need to have much more political will on that. But yes, to a change of use, absolutely. Secondly, we need a right of preemption for councils to acquire property at the local market price. Okay. Thirdly, we need councils to have the power to buy land for housing at the existing use value, typically agricultural land, £1,000 an acre or whatever, and not the inflated value of planning consent. And that's how they do it in Germany. And that's why Germany's got much better quality housing. Fourthly, we need to give local councils the power to charge capital gains tax on any class of property they wish. And that could include second homes, for example. And finally, we need an obligation on any single person that comes in to buy land, an obligation to transfer appropriate housing land for the equivalent price they bought it to the local council or housing association to build houses. So that's just
right,
five.
Wait a minute, Andy. Right. I mean, a lot of people know, you know, we both bang on about land a lot, but that last one was so complicated, my brain just melted.
Okay, you buy 1,000 acres with a big house, right?
Yeah.
The local council housing association needs a couple of acres. You are under a legal obligation then to only keep 998 and pass that at the price you paid for it to the council.
Is that a mechanism you've seen work somewhere?
Well, no, it's not, because you don't need it in other countries, because people don't come in and buy thousands of acres of land.
Okay, right.
But
still, there's just so many people with this tremendous sense of urgency about, a lot of what you're describing there would take a heck of a lot of political change before it's actually going to happen. So what quickly would be done to try to deal with the second home issue?
The change of use that I proposed in the 2019 planning bill could come in, and that could come in very, very quickly. It was opposed at the time by the SNP at the Tories, and when they regulated short-term lets, they gave ministers a power of veto. How's that about local democracy? So, I mean, if the political will is there, we can do a lot of things quite fast. If the political will is just to build lots more houses and see the same number disappearing from the housing market, then it's not going to change.
Okay, Molly?
So, I mean, there's something in the chat here about how a lot of people from Skye now rely on income from Airbnbs and self-catering. That's something that I think is very important. We can't leave people behind here. The other point is that not all homes are suitable for full-time occupancy. We've got old fisher cottages and things like that are rented out as experiences, but they're not for full-time occupancy. So there is more nuance here. One thing that we'd like to do in terms of kickstarting building is to reform business rates so that developers can't land bank as they do at the moment. So that would, create an element of land value tax and mean that if you were sitting on a brownfield site, you would have to do something with it. Otherwise, you're just paying for it to sit there. But I think there's a lot of complicated solutions that have been talked about here. And one of them for me is just devolving council tax powers down to councils and actually letting them decide on what they do and how they set those rates, because at the moment they don't have that power.
Okay, fine. Kirk, this question of short-term lets, second homes, and the lack of housing.
Yeah, I think this policy has been designed for Edinburgh to stop the deluge of Airbnbs has really negatively impacted the Highlands and Islands. A lot of small business owners have little cottages that they rent out, and that's at the heart of the tourist industry. So I think it's backfired a little bit. That really needs to be reconsidered, and local economies need to be thought about a lot more than just the big cities. So a lot of work needs to be done there. I think in terms of, going back to the basics again, development land value tax is very much important to get all this land that's sitting there doing nothing to use. I think there's a major start that needs there.
Can you explain how your land value tax would work?
Well, if you're just sitting there and you're not using it, then there'll be a penalty for that. You just incentivize for people for land banking. I mean, this idea of people just putting their money into land, particularly with the inflation that's on the horizon because of Brexit and all the money that's having to be spent in bailing out for the COVID situation. So inflation's coming. It's going to come hit fast and quick. There's an economic tsunami on the horizon. And so people are putting their money into land. This is exacerbating the problem, making it very expensive for people to buy land. And we need to disincentivize that. And that's why the land tax would be important.
Okay. We've spent already an extraordinary amount of time on 3 questions, which I knew would be what would happen, and we're supposed to stop at 6:30. That might well just be the way of it. Are any of you able to stay for another 10 minutes? I mean, the audience might go, no, but are you able to do that, all of you, or not? Yeah? Is anyone not able to do that?
I might switch to my phone because of my batteries. I'm on the road here, so
okay.
My computer dies, I'll jump onto the phone.
Yes,
so
that happened to Andy at a previous one. So, okay, if you disappear, we know that you're on your phone. Right, so we're okay for another 10 minutes. Right, climate emergency. From Neil Hatburn, what role can the Highlands and Islands play in tackling the climate emergency, and how bold are candidates prepared to be in forming a meaningful response? From Katrina Mallows, how do you plan to use your platform to address the climate change at local, regional and national level and work with young people? Martin Sherring, the interim report from the Scottish Climate Assembly showed wide support for measures to make all housing adequately insulated by 2030. How does the panel think this can be done? So insulation for housing, platform for addressing climate change with young people particularly, and what role can the Highlands and Islands particularly play? So let's start this time with Jamie.
Thanks very much. Sorry, just finding the mute button there. Just looking at that first point, I mean, I think the Highlands Islands already plays a huge role. There was obviously more to be done, but certainly with issues around forestry, you know, the role of the renewable sector, both onshore and offshore, across the Highlands and Islands is absolutely key. We're looking also as well some of the projects and some of the innovation that's being done here, particularly here in Orkney through EMEC, and only this week we've seen, I think, the O2 turbine about to arrive in Orkney, and through projects for better energy use, like the Reflex project, which I think is absolutely very interesting. I saw it. In fact, I think Andy was on that with the Economy and Energy Committee visit to Orkney, or it seems recently, but it was probably a year or so ago. So there's obviously a lot that can be done. There is more around housing. I mean, we've discussed it before. We talked about it earlier about fuel poverty and making sure that there's better, when we're building better, but also
Can I just ask you to talk a bit about that then, Jimmy? Because I know from being on Orkney, the staggering thing is Orkney is sitting with just this cauldron of renewable energy and the highest levels of fuel poverty in Britain. It's only a toss-up between the Western Isles. It's all islands, the Western Isles and sometimes Shetland, all of whom are sitting with loads of renewable energy. So, you know, urgency here. How do we manage to get this all connected up so that Orkney, which is at least blessed, some folk don't like Orkney Council, but at least it's a blooming small council. It's got, you know, some efficiencies of size, presumably. Let's hear some ideas about how you can knit this all up for climate change.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, I just discussed there, I think the Reflex project was a really interesting one, because what that is taking is the use of local energy that might otherwise be wasted, because say if the wind's blowing so much, you have to take, there's so much energy, turbines have to be taken down, actually being used to be stored by local households through battery technology, to be stored through heat, through heating, to be stored in electric vehicles. So it's about using that energy that's being created locally. But that's a pilot project. That's a pilot project at the moment. But that's certainly something that I could see being rolled out, because we see a few communities, like I think it's Fintry, have kind of led the way on community wind. I know the council in Orkney are very keen on wind turbines as well. But there is the potential for more.
That Fintry is connected to the grid.
Yeah, well, I mean,
after how many years, I'm sorry, of Conservative and Lib Dem, even the Con Dem coalition, there was no progress whatsoever on the subsea connectors to any of the island chains that have the biggest degrees of renewable energy practically in Europe.
Yeah, but your question was about how if we're in a community that's got renewables, and that has, very lucky, as it were, for the amount of capacity, how that could be better used when there are such high issues, high levels of fuel poverty. And what I'm saying is that I think we can use it locally, but what you've got to make sure you've got that infrastructure within homes and within communities to take that energy when there's an excess and be able to use it there. So it's about better use of it. But there are other parts of that as well.
A point. The point of it is, Mike Danson is making a point. Scottish and Southern Energy and Ofgem don't want to connect Orkney to the grid, or if they do, they want to put such a small actual connector in that you're going to blow it as soon as you have a couple of wind farms operating. The council can't change that. The point is, I'm afraid it was a Conservative government that brought in privatising electric energy the way it did, and have left this kind of investment really lagging. I can't think of how many hustings I've chaired in my time over decades where the same question's been asked: when will these subsea connectors come in?
Well, I mean, I think the plans for the subsea connectors have been approved now, and so I would expect them to be, to work to be progressing. But as I say, if we're looking at two different issues here, one is around fuel poverty, and one is about the export of electricity out with the Isles. Just to the point, because I think one of the issues that used to come up in Shetland a lot was the way a lot of homes were put on things like night storage or different tariffs, which limited or were very expensive as well. And hopefully that will obviously go if we can make sure that locally sourced locally sourced power is being used in more homes.
Okay, right. Emma, next. I did sort of branch off the point a little bit there. The climate emergency, But also there is this question of how do you manage to get the building blocks together to be able to let communities that have got all this energy use it in situ where they are?
I'll start with the renewable energy one, but I am really excited to hear a question about decarbonising homes, so I'll move on to that one afterwards. The big problem at the moment is that not all energy policy is devolved. So you mentioned a disconnect. That's exactly what it is, because there are different levels at work here. And what we're doing to make sure that communities with large renewable power are benefiting from that and not being penalised as they are with high energy prices is that we are supporting shared ownership of renewable energy projects, and we have an ambition of at least half of renewable energy projects to have at least an element of shared ownership, so that there is that community benefit. Moving on to decarbonising homes, I think that next to transport, buildings are the biggest emitters of CO2 equivalent, and a huge retrofit programme is needed to address the climate emergency. It's in our climate change action plan, we recognise that almost 80% of existing homes are still likely to be in use in 2050, and some of those were built over 50 years ago. So we need to make these green. We need to build them up to the standard that we're now applying to new builds to tackle both climate change and fuel poverty.
Okay, how are we going to do that? I'm old enough to remember the Greens, actually, Patrick Harvey, suggesting a method of insulation which was going to be universal insulation. And that was rejected actually by Alex Salmond, who was leading the SNP at the time. I can remember sitting in the press gallery. Now it was said that utilities, who are supposed to be doing a lot of insulation, they're the guys, they'll do it. Have they been? And if not, how are we going to do it better?
It's about setting those standards, and I think that bringing older homes up to the standards that we expect of new builds, and we are, to do that, investing £1.6 billion in the next Parliament to tackle that, and that's a target to decarbonise the heating of 1 million homes in the next 19 years.
Right, is decarbonising only about insulation for you?
No, and I mean, this is something that I deal with in council quite a lot. It's also about bringing up cladding for certain homes that were built a long time ago, dealing with windows that aren't up to scratch. It's far more than that, and also the mode of heating in the home, making sure that it's not too expensive.
I entirely take your point about the reserved powers in energy, but heating is 100% devolved to the Scottish Parliament. Where's our district heating systems?
Well, this is why we're putting so much money. I mean, 1.6 billion is a lot of money to be putting into retrofitting these homes.
Okay, right. Ariane?
So we've got a green investment plan. The Scottish Greens want to invest a lot of money, renewable energy, public transport, housing, and restoring nature. All of that creating 100,000 jobs so we can do the just transition, taking people who are focused on oil and gas sector and other sectors and move them into other jobs if they want to take them. They can also move into other areas as well. So, a lot of people have brought up the issues there, limitations around some aspects of renewable energy. I've just been having a really interesting conversation about communities being very concerned about the Greens proposal around onshore wind, and because we want to revitalize that. It's going to be really needed as we move people onto heating that comes from electricity rather than oil and gas, LPG. So, that's an interesting piece. And I think that I wanted to say that in all of what we're doing in terms of green investment and reindustrializing, as Magnus talked about it, as we reindustrialize, we have to do it with people on the ground. We have to do it with the communities, because I had so much pushback from people recently about the onshore wind, and they were heartened to hear that what the Greens want is community ownership, 20% of renewable projects owned by communities. We want communities to be involved in the pre-planning conversations of anything that's going on. That's not been happening. And so, and also involved in local place plans so that people can actually be, have that possibility of influencing and shaping their environment. And I think they've just touched back on the land reform piece, which is that, the Scottish Land, and I think Molly brought this in really well, which is to give the Scottish Land Commission the power to enforce those ideas that they've got of transparent land plans, public interest tests. As we as we reindustrialize the area, we've got to make sure that people are not having it done to them, but we're doing it with them. So that's just some piece.
Right, Andy?
Right, well, this is the big question of our time. I mean, the Highlands and Islands have got huge opportunity, not just as Jamie talked about in renewable energy, but in how we use the land. In terms of our peatlands, there's vast erosion taking place, and there's a lot of carbon emission taking place on land that's been degraded for far, far too long. So a big, big reforestation program, as I say, in the hands of locals and communities, because too often we see the opportunities that come with new imperatives, like mitigating climate change, go to the rich and the wealthy. Why are Brewdog, a big brewing company in the northeast of Scotland, buying Highland estates? They're buying it because they get millions of pounds in grants to reforest and they get carbon credits. That money should be going into local communities and not industrialists, brewers or otherwise in other parts of Scotland. I mean, on the housing thing, we had a review in 2007 when the SNP came to power, arguing for net zero by 2020 in terms of building standards. The Scottish government dropped that then in the wake of the financial crash because they thought they wanted to incentivise house builders and they didn't want high standards. That was ridiculous. We've lost actually 15 years in that. And again, because people have to pay so much money for land, they've got less money to pay for quality housing. And again, Germany sorted that post-war. And again, we've got 1.6 million acres of public land owned by the Forestry Commission, owned by Scottish ministers. When that was leased out for renewable rounds, it went to 4 multinational corporations. That should have been local public-private partnerships to build district heating networks, to renew, to generate wind, hydro, and biomass.
Okay, Andy, yeah. I'm not thinking that your blood pressure is going to stand you being an MSP again, because I mean, and listen, the reason I know, because you've spent, you know, as John was saying, you've spent half your life really thinking this stuff through. But let's face it, it's just none of this is going to move very quickly, is it? So just on this question, what do you think can be done viably for the Highlands within the next term of Parliament to try to kind of shift quickly on the climate change front? Oops, now I've silenced you, or else you've silenced yourself, Andy.
Sorry, yes, no, but the key thing is a process thing. You must put local people, communities, and local government at the heart of these solutions. You don't rely on the wealthy and the big corporations, and you must get revenue flows into the hands of local communities. So for example, on land reform, I would get rid of the Crown owning the seabed, just nationalise it and make sure that the revenues from the seabed flow to local communities and councils as well. And that would allow them to invest in carbon projects and climate mitigation. I mean, all across Europe, you find that the organisations are dealing with this best are municipalities and cities. Okay, right. Because Molly? They have the power.
Yep.
Lesley, I mean, it is a huge question. I want to touch upon stuff that was said about new build homes and the standard of new build homes. They're not actually up to standard as it is. We need to be aiming for passive house standards. So we need really ambitious targets here. I would say 2025 for social housing and 2030 for all new builds. Otherwise, we're going to continue leaking heat, and this insulation issue is going to go on forever. But on the point of insulation, I've had
just on that, there's a point there from Jochen who's just come in to say we need community heating systems like ground source heat pumps on a section of developers' land as a planning condition that heats all the houses they build.
Yeah, I would say that there is a lot of merit in that. I would say that there is not one solution for all homes. So we want to put heat pumps in some places. In other places, we want to, transition gas boilers to clean fuels. That it really depends on the area and where people are physically located, because we've got such differing levels of infrastructure all over the place.
Right. Okay. Thank you for just that breath. Kirk, the question of climate change. Climate emergency?
Yeah, no, great question. I think, with the move to electricity, we have a significant problem. You have problem number one with storing electricity, and 2, transporting it. It's very different from petrol, and it's carbon where you can move it around. And oftentimes it's cheaper to buy petrol in London as it has been in the Highlands. That's been a traditional problem. It's the same problem that's going on with electricity. Electricity costs more up in the Highlands and Islands than it does anywhere else, which is crazy. we have all this potential with wave, wind, and that needs to be well joined up in thinking in terms of building, redoing houses, and it all comes into the idea of these district heating systems. You could actually be using this electricity where it's produced, and incentivizing people to not just this idea of insulating homes. Part of the problem with that is some of these solutions have been awful, where people drill holes into cavity walls and pump foam into there, which causes flammable issues. Not some of it's treated. However, a larger problem that seems to be developing at pace is homes that have been done a few years ago now have terrible damp conditions inside. So you can't have solutions that cause more problems and all that. So
okay,
some ideas around that, but we need to incentivize people to build new homes. We need to free up land that's not being used. What about getting rid of VAT on building supplies to incentivize people to do it themselves?
Right,
and
that's a Westminster shout.
Precisely the point.
So okay, but this is a Holyrood election.
Now, of course, but this Holyrood election is about independence now because of the Alba party. And what we are saying is that we have an opportunity here to force independence sooner rather than later. And as soon as we get into, within 3 weeks, we put motions down that we need to negotiate. So
Kirk, as many people will realise, I'm not entirely unsympathetic, but this is not Hustings that is kind of focusing on that. We have, what have we got? Sort of something like 4 minutes left to go. So forgive me for jumping in because John hasn't spoken. And there's still 2 whole areas we haven't even got into, which is what a shame. So John, climate emergency.
I'm very conscious of time, but I think this is the key dividing line at this election. Labour wants to focus on the environmental crisis facing us, not more division. And frankly, Alba putting a second independence referendum ahead of the climate emergency that we face is just absolutely shocking. What got me into politics is the fuel poverty and child poverty that we face in the Highlands and Islands. A third of homes in the Highlands and Islands still face fuel poverty. And the SNP's promised Warms Homes Bill failed to deliver any change to tackle that in the last 14 years. So, Labour have a plan here. And Emma mentioned, we do need to improve housing and tackle the decarbonisation of homes. But she didn't give us a solution of how we're going to do that. So Labour actually want to establish a national housing agency that will tackle this issue head on and ensure that we can improve our homes and make sure they're at least energy rating C or higher by 2030. So we actually have a concrete plan to deliver that. And don't see the other parties offering that at this election. So if you do want to tackle the climate emergency and not go back to the arguments of the past, it's a vote for Labour at this election. Right.
Gosh, that was a awfully flourish at the end there thingy. Now Ariane has had to go because she's off to another meeting. I know everybody needs to go. So I'm looking at this plethora of really excellent questions. So I need to just ask you one last one that's going to be a relatively quick one. She said, how do you think the North Coast 500 should be managed for the benefit of the Highlands? There's loads of questions in exactly on the same thing from Clifford Piper, Shoris Mackay, Linda Wilson, John Dunrig. All of this, how do we strike the right balance on the North Coast 500 so it becomes a benefit to the local community affected by it and reduce the negative aspects of that? So the first one is Emma for this.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a really difficult one, and I'm not surprised there are so many questions on it because I think I've been asked about this at every single Hustings I've been to. I think at the moment the real issue is the lack of monetising of the North Coast 500, and I think that the transient visitor levy that we're going to be able to introduce is going to go a long way to making sure that councils are getting the income from it to upkeep the roads and to provide waste services.
Okay, Ariane's gone. Andy?
Well, put it in the hands of local people and communities, not a Danish billionaire. I don't understand how a big, rich person can set up a company called North Coast 500, get the country's tourism agency and the roads authority then to put up signs on their behalf. It's utterly ridiculous, and leave everyone else to pick up the pieces. I mean, no other country does this nonsense, right? So the answer.
So in the short term, what would you like to have happen this year?
Well, there needs to be much more investment in tourism infrastructure. We saw that in the 2019 tourism season, not so much in 2020 for obvious reasons, and we fear the year to come. For far too long, This region has been a region from which people, some who live here, many who don't, have extracted resources, extracted value, and put nothing back in.
Okay,
so
but for example, would you double track the single track?
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely, we need better road infrastructure. It's ridiculous.
Right. So the quaint single track would just go.
Well, yes, I mean, I was on, the side of Loch Lomond in the A82. I mean, outside Highlands and Islands, but it serves the west. And, two double-decker lorries meet, articulated lorry. One has to reverse on a trunk road.
Okay, Molly?
Very simply, I think it's about getting people who own the NC 500 to invest in the roads. It's about road safety, actually. We have a huge issue, and we've had years of under-maintained roads for various reasons. I do think we need to double track things. It's a sort of, accident waiting to happen scenario. And for me, it's just all about, as a priority, the road infrastructure.
Okay, Kirk?
Yeah, so not to go back on what you suggested not to, but with independence and getting the powers to borrow internationally, interest rates at 0%, massive capital investment, infrastructure projects, dealing with the roads, expanding them out, not just for cars, but for bicycles, so people can ride on their bikes and walk. People trying to walk along country roads, the amount of accidents that happen is far too insane that's going on there. We need to improve the infrastructure. We need to incentivize people to start businesses all along the route. And the idea of the caucus idea, I think, would be very fitting, and you could be quite right about that. Specific groupings set up to see how we can exploit these sorts of opportunities for local people, attract more people to come, and make sure that it doesn't destroy the local environment. That's for sure.
Okay, right, John.
Yeah, there's lots of tensions between tourism and the environment, and the North Coast 500 has been a prime example of that. There was concerns about the infrastructure even before the pandemic hit, and obviously with an increase in staycations, I think we're likely to see the pressure on the NC 500 just increase and increase. So for me, it goes back to properly funding local government to make sure that there's decent infrastructure the whole length of that route, which includes access to toilets, access to services, and improving our roads infrastructure. So Labour has a plan for a sustainable tourism plan for Scotland, and that would fundamentally mean that we could lower that tension between tourism and looking after the environment. But obviously it's crucial to the Highlands and Islands that we recover our tourist industry after the pandemic, but we need to make sure it's done in a sustainable and environmentally sound way.
Jamie?
Thanks very much. I think if Andy hadn't already left the Greens, I think advocating a road building program might have caused some issues anyway. But I mean, it's a good point. And I think it's absolutely right. One of the issues, one of the pressures has been on the cost that the Highland Council have because of cuts to their budget. So there's areas around that. But I mean, I've had as an MSP a huge number of concerns raised with me around the state of the roads there, but also things like dirty camping, and littering. Those facilities aren't there. That's causing problems. And the pressure of tourism isn't just in that road, but it's also in other parts as well. And I think that's probably we do need to look at how we can make sure that tourism, which is vital for the Highlands and Islands, is done in a responsible manner. And where there are pressures, we can help to ease them, whether it's moving people to other sites and making other areas attractive to visit as well.
Right. Okay, no instant solution to the North Coast 500, but then that would, if you could manage that, you could actually practically be running the European Union if you felt like doing it. We're going to close now with another poll. The result wasn't shown to you on the first one, so this will be interesting. If everybody would like who's remaining, would you please vote now on what you intend to do with your regional vote? And we'll see whether there's been any change during the course of the debate. Right, I hope everybody can just vote quickly because, we're over time and I'm conscious that candidates will probably need to go off and either stop talking and relax or even do another event. So Peter, can you tell us if we're sort of getting to closing that vote? Right, that looks like it's closed. Right. Now, what are we seeing here? Was this the first poll, Peter? Can you come on and speak like a human?
This is indeed the first poll.
Right, so is the second one going to replace it or sit side by side?
I think it's going to have to replace it. I don't think it should both at the same time.
Darn blast it. Then nobody will, only people with, extraordinary, oh no, I know what I can do. I can take a picture of it. Right, how's your horses?
Feel free to do screenshots or take photos.
Right, okay.
Okay, and then share the second one.
Right, so Alba is pretty much the same. Andy has done awfully well. He's gained 15%. The Conservatives haven't moved. The Greens have lost a couple of percentage. Labour, again, have lost a bit. Lib Dems are up a couple of percent, and the SNP are up 1.5% roughly.
Sorry, Lesley, to be completely true, it's the Lib Dems that have gone down and Labour has gone up.
Yes, Labour's got 2 extra votes. Thank you so much.
Okay, right. Sorry, I thought I was roughly right in that, but very possibly not. Anyway, you can, hopefully we will post this somewhere so that people can actually see the two side by side, and my, obviously, COD maths will not interfere with your perception of who did awfully well. I think everybody did, given that we've been hurling questions at people at a rate of knots, and huge questions that people are being asked to deal with. So anyway, my thanks to everybody for organising it, the Pebble Trust in particular, everybody who was here tonight. Neil, are you popping up in Vision to say something meaningful at the end, quickly? Because everybody's going, we're off.
That was the idea, Lesley. I mean, I just, got the weekend off to a massive start. And I'd like to thank everyone for their humour, their courtesy, their ideas. We're not short of them. Lesley, fantastic chairing as ever. Just exactly what we needed. What amazing ability you have there, seriously. And yeah, just I'd like to thank everyone. So in the sort of good old-fashioned Highland alphabetical order, I'd like to thank Andy, Ariane, Emma, Jamie, John, Kirk, and Molly. Other thanks really have to go out to the Pebble Trust trustees and to the technical backup, Peter, behind things, of which it wouldn't have happened at all. And then to everyone that joined the call. I mean, it's fantastic, really. It's very tempting to comment, but would I trade business for being a politician? Probably not. There's just so much we can do in the Highlands. There's so much we need to do in the coming 5 years. And it's going to be a really interesting space. So power to you all. Thanks very much. Enjoy the weekend.
And there's just one question that maybe someone could answer. How many were on the call? People want to know, because I suppose it's a bit relevant with that voting as well. Do you know?
Yeah,
Peter?
I saw around about 110 at the highest point. Peter?
Right, so
that's about right. Peaked at 110, and we've now dropped to about 80-ish as folks get hungry and go out to the sun.
There's the big hint. Okay, so thanks everybody for doing your darndest, and good luck in all that follows in the campaign and the election on May the 6th.